All right, and with that, welcome and thank you for attending our final webinar in this year's installment of the Duchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. It's always wild how fast these months fly by, and we thank you for attending however many you've been able to attend. If you've attended some, you know me. My name is Brian Schneedy. I'm the Outreach and Preserve Manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy. Tonight, we're absolutely excited to close out this year's series with the research ecologist at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute, Steve Kutos. But before we get started, my role tonight is to go over the basic logistics about this webinar. After that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted and chat is disabled for this event to ensure that there's no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. Please enter all questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we'll try to combine them based on topics. Third, closed caption is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, with my pleasure to hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the DLC, this webinar series, and tonight's presenter.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy, and I'm so glad you could all join us this evening. I think many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, let me give you a quick overview. The Duchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we have worked with hundreds of landowners and protected nearly 48,000 acres of land. We're grateful to all of these conservation-minded folks and grateful to our sponsors, the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund, Labella Associates, Structure Works, and Mutual of America. We're so glad you can be here for the last webinar in our 4th season of Earth Matters. This season, we've been learning about the wonders of trees and forests and the important ecological roles they play. I hope that these webinars have helped you to see the trees and forests around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in their branches and buds, to see the connections between trees and the wildlife they support, and to find a new appreciation for these diverse and resilient communities called forests. So we're really glad tonight to welcome Dr. Steve Kutos as our final speaker for this season. Steve completed his PhD at Fordham University in 2021, so he's practically a local and did some of his work in the Hudson Valley area. And he's now a postdoctoral research ecologist at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute, the Center for Conservation Genomics. His research explores the microbial world to answer our community scale questions and examines the relationship between plants and the microorganisms that live on and around them. Let's remember that fungi and plants have coexisted for millions of years, and without both organisms, our world would look very different. His current research examines the links between the microbiome and the conservation and flavor quality of coffee, which I think is a research we can all get behind. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours. And Steve is going to talk to us about partners for life, fungi and trees.
Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me okay and see my slides and everything? Is it all good? Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thanks for everyone for coming and letting me chat about fungi and trees for a bit. Yeah, so my name is Steve. I'm a researcher again at the Smithsonian. And today I'm going to talk about fungi and trees and their important relationship. But first, a note about how I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to anthropomorphize a lot throughout this entire presentation. As a scientist, I know that's probably not the best way to talk about plants and fungi, but I find it helpful when discussing this particular topic. Okay. So something that I'm fascinated by, and since I've sort of started my research, is the incredible complexity of plant life, and that's whether plants or trees, They come in all shapes, sizes, colors, smells, wonderful functions, the ways in which they are foundations for ecosystems. And part of that complexity, at least, can be attributed to microorganisms. These organisms that obviously we can't see, but things like bacteria, things like archaea, things like viruses, things like fungi. These incredibly small organisms that generally we need a microscope for, besides, of course, our fungi friends, have existed long before plant life, long before animal life. They have existed on this planet for billions of years. And they exist today in incredible diversity, incredible numbers. And, we as scientists, the scientific community, know, a good deal about these organisms, although we're still learning everything about how they act. But something we know is they're everywhere. They're everywhere across our planet. Everywhere in the room with you is covered by these microorganisms. And again, they've been on this planet for billions of years. So what roles, why are these organisms here? What are they doing? Is something that my research really focuses on. So microorganisms, again, these unseen communities are incredibly considerable, or excuse me, play considerable roles in the health and function of many organisms. Sorry if y'all can hear that lovely dog barking, I apologize. For things like humans, they help us with food digestion, they help regulate our mood, and they're incredibly important about fighting pathogens. And for ecosystems, they play just as critical roles. They are critical for the recycling of nutrients that our planet requires. They help plants grow, which again, I'll touch on here in just a bit. And they live in every single habitat that one could think, from the North Pole all the way to the deep sea. They are there. And so if we look at sort of the human-centric example of what these organisms perform, we have things like, I don't know if y'all can see my little mouse here, but we have things like archaea that are found in our gut that help us reduce methane production. We have this crazy looking one on the right. That's a virus. It is the most abundant organism on the entire planet. It's the most abundant organism found within and on the human body. And they play incredibly important roles in our guts to reduce bacteria and other pathogens. We have things like fungi that grow on our feet that, maybe we don't love athlete's foot, but we also have certain bacteria that are found in our mouth that both help and promote, promote and are detrimental to things like gingivitis. So, that's the human-centric approach. But what about the tree approach? Do microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, play just as important roles as they do on the human body? So over the past 30, 40 years, answer to this question is yes, absolutely. So if we look at, just, a tree, microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, are found everywhere. The flower, the fruit, on the leaf, within the stem, within the roots, on the roots, they're found everywhere. These are 6 fungi that I cultured from the surface of a red oak tree in Armonk, New York. They are incredibly interesting organisms. And so for that, we sort of need to head underground. So if you'll allow me to really focus on a little bit of underground features and how that links to above ground features, I think we'll start underground. So I know this is generally a tree-based webinar series, but we'll focus a little bit here on soils. So I consider them, soil itself, one of the critical, essential natural resources we have on our entire planet. Soil itself plays incredibly important ecosystem services from, that's where our plants grow generally. That's where a lot of carbon is stored, which we love. That's where the global nutrients are recycled. It's also, important for humans and where our food comes from, and water filtration. It's also one of the most species diverse ecosystems on the entire planet, arguably the most diverse. Things with, all sorts of soil fauna, arthropods, earthworms, amphibians, and those microorganisms that I talked about: protists, bacteria, fungi, and of course viruses. And fungi are going to be the main focus for today, obviously by the title of the talk. And I consider fungi to be a shaper of the current world we live in. It is, I think, no argument that the planet would look incredibly different without these organisms. So just a quick sort of background on what these are. There's somewhere around 1 to 5 million species of fungi that exist on this planet. Scientists, we have only sort of identified around 140 to 150,000 species. But there could be millions that we just don't or haven't classified yet. And one of the reasons why is because they are incredibly hard to grow in a laboratory. If we can't grow them, generally we can't study them. So there are millions of species of fungi that we don't really know sort of what they're doing. And if we look at sort of a tree of all of life here, hopefully you can see the little mouse here, but fungi are more closely related to us, to animals, than they are to the other microorganisms like bacteria and archaea. In fact, fungi are more closely related to humans, animals, than they are to plants themselves. So fungi evolved somewhere around 1 to 2 billion years ago. There's huge estimated range there, generally because fossil records are poor. But what that means is that fungi have existed, or what we would consider fungi have existed on this planet, with plants, in that aquatic ocean, prehistoric ocean, for billions of years. And they followed, and I'll talk about it here in a second, or they help plants get onto land itself. So these organisms don't have chlorophyll. They cannot photosynthesize like our tree friends. So they need to absorb dissolved molecules, nutrition across a membrane, just like the human gut does. Absorb dissolved molecules across a membrane. These organisms have been both harmful and helpful to humanity. They've caused some of the worst, and still do, plant diseases, and are considered incredible pathogens throughout human history. They've also given us, anything fermented, including bread, which I would argue is the best food invention of all time. It's also given us penicillin, which was discovered, of course, by accident, quote unquote. Again, one could consider penicillin the greatest medical discovery of all time. And sort of leading into the next slide here, they are the fundamental decomposers in nature. This recycling that these organisms provide help the planet and the globe function as it does. So these organisms are critical for, one, storing carbon. So plants, soil, fungi are incredibly important for storing carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. So storing that carbon that we don't want into the atmosphere. These organisms store it, which is fantastic. We love that. And then, as mentioned, these organisms are incredibly important for the way in which our globe functions. The recycling of nutrients is how our planet grows and then decays, grows, decays. All of that is facilitated by these wonderful organisms. Okay, so what do they look like? Well, they look like this incredible Diversity, just like plant life, in size and shape and color and smells. These organisms are, just as diverse, maybe not as large as our tree friends, but, incredibly diverse. But of course, I'm showing a trick here. These are, of course, the reproductive structures. Fungi also look like this. They also grow in these really interesting forms that, destroy our vegetables and our fruits, and again, act as plant pathogens. They are incredible growers. In fact, they're one of the few organismal groups that we have on this planet that can grow in two distinct forms. Um, they can grow in these sort of single-celled, sort of ovally shapes. Generally, we consider these to be yeasts. They also grow like this cotton candy-like threads. If you're digging in your garden a little bit and you've pulled out something that's like very, very white, very, very white, and you're like, that's probably a plant, but it also probably could be the fungi. Um, this is another way in which these organisms grow. And I promise I'll get to trees here in just a second. So if we look at a fungi or a mushroom, this piece, the mushroom itself, is again just the reproductive structure. The body or the form of a fungi, to me, is this threads, these just sort of wispy cotton candy-like threads that weave themselves through, bread or within soil. So I'm just gonna, hopefully this plays for y'all. I'm gonna try, if I can move this out of the way, sorry, to play this. Hopefully this is coming across here. So this is obviously a microscopic view. There's a line right in the middle of this slide that's essentially, below that is a little ruler, and above that is mycorrhizal fungi growing, these threads that move through soils. I'm just going to hit play one more time. These organisms grow and then just sort of weave themselves through soil, through bread, and they can grow incredibly quickly, sort of as they move, as they grow, as they develop. Every time I show this video, some folks thinks it's kind of creepy. I guess it is. It's kind of weird looking. So when we sort of move this idea of what fungi are and how they act and what they do and how they grow, let's sort of bring this into this sort of tree focus. So if we pick like one of these beautiful pines here, let's say this one right in the middle. If we think about what that tree has a lot of, most likely the tree can manufacture sugars consistently. If it's got a good light source, it can photosynthesize and, tons of sugars, tons of nutrition for that tree. Um, you know, different trees have different efficiencies within that, but generally they have a lot of sugars, a lot of food. But what they need generally is nutrients, things like phosphorus or nitrogen or potassium, maybe some other metals. They use these nutrients to develop new cells, develop new proteins, new DNA, to fix wounds if they're damaged, to develop fruits and flowers if they have them. They rely on these nutrients to develop, to grow, and that's from a young sapling to a mature tree, like here in the background. So we know trees have, in theory, a lot of sugar, but generally they're limited by those nutrients. So this is where fungi and plants come together, um, and why I consider them to be linked for the sort of shape of the planet now, which includes that incredible diversity of plant life that we have. Somewhere like 370,000 species of plants that exist on this planet um, could be attributed to their fungal partners. So this relationship that fungi and plants, trees form is known as mycorrhizae, a term that I'm sure many of you have heard before. This word literally just means fungal. Myco is fungal, and rhizae is root, so fungal root. So in this relationship, It's essentially a trading partnership between fungi and plants. And over 80% of all plant species on this planet currently, so what, 310,000 species or somewhat, form a physical relationship where the fungi is physically connected to, sorry, physically connected to the tree. And they trade, there we go. So in this trade, the fungi provide nutrients to the tree, like phosphorus, like nitrogen, again, allowing that tree to develop, to grow, to develop fruits and flowers, obviously if it's an angiosperm. In return for those nutrients, the tree, what is going on with my PowerPoint? There we go. In response, the tree provides sugars, food, to the fungi. So the species of fungi that we as scientists classify mycorrhizal fungi as generally have lost the ability to degrade organic material around them. So they need the sugar provided by their tree partners to survive. So this is, thousands of species of fungi require the sugar provided by trees in order for them to live and survive and perform the incredibly key ecosystem roles that they play. Generally this is a good consensus, but most scientists agree now that because fungi existed on land for maybe 100 to 500 million years before plants started their migration out of aquatic ecosystems, most likely this relationship from fungi to tree helped plants colonize land, again, somewhere in that 450 million years ago. So generally, we can thank the fungi for helping plants, again, move onto land and then diversify into the incredible complexity that we see now. Because of how sort of dynamic and linked these two organisms are, plants that grow with their mycorrhizal partners grow better, they reach maturity, they develop more flowers, more fruits, again, if they have them. And countless studies show that once fungi are in a soil, they help plants establish, help trees establish. Okay. So again, if you're sort of digging in your garden or backyard or forest or whatever, and you're seeing something that's very sort of root-like, but has this very white appearance, certain fungal species, mycorrhizal fungi species, have the ability to form these little cords. So again, if you're digging and you see something very white, it's probably fungi, and that's generally a good thing to see in a soil. So just for a quicker view here, so this little upside down V is a plant root, and you can see all of those little threads weaving themselves around the plant root, just really thin microscopic threads physically attaching themselves to this plant root. This is just another microscopic image. The bright green here is the plant root. And then you can see, sort of hard to see maybe, but the little cotton candy-esque sort of weave of the fungal threads, again, weaving themselves all around the root. The little circles here are the spores in which the fungi develop. Okay, so I don't need to tell this audience that trees, plants undergo incredible stressors in the current planet, things from competition from invasive species, or outbreaks of pests or pathogens, or increasing amounts of drought. They also deal with sort of more human sort of effects like habitat fragmentation, which we see a lot, obviously, here in the Northeast. Pollution from a variety of sources, mechanical or industrial pollution, things like that, as well as land use change, the conversion of land for agriculture or non-natural forested woodland land. Through, again, countless studies, fungi and plants not only sort of trade things between them, fungi actually help to mediate the responses of all plants, all trees, to those stressors. So fungi, just inherent by their nature, improve soil structure. As mentioned, they help plants um, gain access to those limiting nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. They help plants gather soil moisture. Fungi in the soil grow really quickly, really rapidly, accessing those soil moisture patches and then shuttling that to the tree. They help to reduce toxin accumulation, things like aluminum or zinc or lead accumulations. There's been some fantastic work showing fungi may be able to help those old mining areas reduce the toxins, allowing trees, plants to grow. They also can outcompete those pathogens that we don't want in soils. And something that I find incredible helpful to sort of guide where we sort of are in the understanding of this relationship is to think about the two main types of mycorrhizae. So there are four types, but we consider two to be the main two types. The first is what's known as arbuscular. Over 200,000 plant species, 70%, 40%, somewhere 75% of all plant taxa form this relationship with their fungal partners. So we, as scientists, group certain fungal species into this arbuscular classification. So if we look at this little graphic here in the bottom right here, so the fungi will start as a spore, this little pink color. And it'll grow, 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 grow. It'll find the surface of the plant root and then physically penetrate into the cell wall of maybe 3 or 4 cells deep. And then they will create these little fan shapes, again, within the cell of the plant root. And this is where that trade occurs. The nutrients, the water, all of that occurs right here. And this is a little microscopic image, just all of those little threads weaving themselves through. So if we take a step back, when we would look at this from afar, we would like, oh, this is a pathogenic infection. The fungi is, penetrating into the cell wall. We wouldn't want that. But, over 200,000 plant species, countless individuals, quote unquote, and this is anthropomorphized, but allow that infection, quote unquote infection, to occur, again, because of this bond that fungi and plants have had for millions of years. The other main type is what are known as ectos. So these, for whatever reason, have lost the ability to penetrate into the cell. So instead, they just wrap themselves around plant root cells. And again, this is where that trade occurs. So this little image here on the left, the green is that fungi, the microorganism fungi, and then the blue is a plant root. So we're looking at sort of a cross section. And the fungi, you can just see it like weaving itself through around the plant cells. And again, this is where that trade occurs. The reason why I think it's really important to sort of highlight the differences between the two main types is because of the forms in which these groups grow in. So the ectomycorrhizal group, the ones that again surround the plant cell, these are ones that we may see on like a forest or woodland walk. Chanterelles, the agarics, truffle mushrooms, we may see these in a little walk. And generally, if you are seeing them in a forested walk or a hike, there's a good chance that they are physically connected to nearby trees, nearby plants, again, in this sort of relationship that fungi and plants provide. Those group that, again, can physically penetrate into the cell walls, these do not form mushrooms. So we generally cannot see these. They're very small, exist in soils, but generally they don't form the little mushrooms. Additionally, through really great work in the early 2000s, early 2010s, somewhere, last, I guess, 20 years or so. We've started to map how different plants, different trees, which mycorrhizal fungi they associate with. So with ectomycorrhizal, again, those ones that wrap themselves around the plant root cell, things like oak, pine, cedar, beeches only associate with this group of mycorrhizal fungi. Whereas things like maples, magnolias, dogwoods, and lilacs only associate with this group of mycorrhizal fungi. This gives us a really nice way to map what's happening above ground, let's say changes in northeastern forests over the next 50 years, to what's happening below ground. It's a really nice way for us to sort of make broad understandings and predict, potentially, how changing forests, changing woodlands, changing tree species distributions over the next 50, 100 years, how that's going to impact soil functionality. Okay, so this led me particularly at some of my work to focus on, do different tree species have different community of fungi? Each of us has a distinct microbiome. It is as distinct as a fingerprint, and that's due to who we interact with, what kind of food we eat, where we go, if we have a dog or not. And so I was sort of thinking, what about for trees? What about for these really large organisms? Do they have distinct fungal communities? So I did this work at Fordham University during my PhD in a research station in Armonk, New York, just down at Westchester, using three common, and I know y'all will know these tree species, red maple, red oak, and river birch. Really common, relatively common species within those forests. And what I found was, yes, they absolutely can have distinct fungal communities. And there's a lot going on this graphic, so bear with me here. So we'll just focus on this one on the left, the one that says solo. Each species has a different color, green here, and the dots are a fungal community. And the closer those dots are together, the more similar those fungal communities are. And so what this graph is just essentially showing is, yes, each of these three species has a distinct fungal community profile within their soils. So each oak, maple, birch has a distinct profile. Once you mix them together, like what we see here on the image on the right, those communities start to merge and accumulate together and change, potentially changing how they function. So yes, they do or can have their distinct communities, but when we see like a forest or a woodland, those communities, those distinct fungi that associate with only one of these species, again, coming together, trying to figure out, which species is dominant, what are they doing, that sort of thing. Not only do they change species compositions, but this graph is just essentially showing the amount of fungal species within the soil. I want to highlight this yellow box here. When the tree is planted by itself, there's a good amount of fungal species diversity. But once you increase, when you add species tree diversity to the system, it incredibly increases, statistically increases the amount of fungal species. And generally, not always, but generally, fungal diversity is an important signal of soil health and forest health in a particular area. Okay. So I'm talking about, like, this is always helpful. This is always a great relationship. Fungi and plants, they've existed for millions of years. It's always a good thing. But of course, that's not totally how it works always. If we, again, take one quick step back, these organisms can be parasitic. That's just how these organisms can function. So mycorrhizal fungi can be parasitic to trees in a forest or a woodland. They can take more sugar from the tree and without giving those nutrients. So they can, again, take more, so almost being a parasite. And this depends on a ton of different conditions within a forest or a woodland, um, hundreds of different conditions. But just wanted to highlight, it's not always a good thing between these two different organism groups. 637, perfect. Okay. So something I like to highlight is this sort of thinking about plants and fungi and how strong this relationship is. So not only do fungi sort of shuttle nutrients, shuttle water to the plant in some cases also um, can shuttle obviously sugars, but also water to fungi. And that is with this research group tested. I'm only going to show or highlight a couple studies, but I find this one to be incredibly informative. So about 23 years ago, this research group had a very simple thought. They tested California live oak. They were like, how can we break apart this tree fungal partner? Like, can we break this apart? Can we separate these two organisms? And what they tried to do was essentially um, uh, give the oak system incredible drought. So what they found was, yes, in very dry soils, like 80 days of no water, which, for even a California species is a very low amount of water. The trees still distributed water to their fungal partners. So even when things were, super stressed for this California live oak, incredibly high stress in this system, there was still movement of nutrients, resources, water within this partnership. So the thought was like, okay, is there, something going on that, the tree fungi are sharing resources to keep this mutualism alive. Again, generally, both the tree and the fungi need for survival this relationship to form. So this led to some really interesting work in the early 2010s, that were like, okay, so there's a lot of resource trading and the fungi is helping the tree and the tree is helping the fungi, and I'm showing a plant here, but bear with me. So is it the fungi or the plants that quote unquote anthropomorphized control this resource movement between this bond? Like what's controlling this? And what they found was it's maybe the fungi are controlling this a little bit more. So fungi will store nutrients, meaning not give it to the tree or plant when the plant or tree is not providing sugars. So they seemingly, like, if they are not getting in this trade, they're not getting anything, they're not going to give anything. In this particular study, the fungi stored, 9 times, 10 times more nutrients when they were not given sugars from a plant. So if they're given sugars, if they're allowed to get sugars, then they will provide nutrients to the plant or tree. Okay, so this leads us to a topic that is all over right now, and that's common mycorrhizal networks, a term I'm sure many of you have heard before. I'm going to pause and just say that currently, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, as a scientist that works somewhat in this field, that we need more evidence to fully understand this incredibly complex and dynamic biological and ecological, I guess, dynamic between fungi and trees. Studies in the last few years are starting to disagree or sort of raise questions about some of the things that have sort of been said out in the sort of modern area. this is a good thing. This is a great thing for science. You know, some great discoveries have just been occurred in the past couple of years, even early this year, almost a couple weeks ago now. Incredible discoveries. So this is a good thing. But just to highlight, if anybody has, maybe you've read this, the New York Times article from 2022 sort of developed this idea of like, all right, let's take a step back. Let's wait here. Now, a lot of this work, and again, I'm sure you've heard this name before, started by Dr. Simard and colleagues in the Pacific Northwest, early, or I should say late 1990s, early 2000s, and you know, captured the imagination of millions of folks, including myself. Her work is, I would argue, the reason why I'm even a researcher right now. So she's a big sort of science influence to me. So she has this wonderful quote, you know, this infinite biological pathways connecting trees. And that's sort of what we're going to sort of highlight for the rest of today. So her group and others around that time termed this massive network the Wood Wide Web, which is genius. I wish I came up with that. But in theory, and you'll hear me use that word a few times now, is an incredibly complex, like hyper complex, ever-changing, incredibly dynamic social community network between plants, trees, and fungi. So there's the word theory again. I'm going to use theory for the rest of the slides. It's just my way of hedging, which is a nice plant joke, because I just think we need to pause, just to wait for more evidence to come out. But in theory, is, you know, we know that fungi or plants are physically connected to one another. But what about, let's say, like one fungi in a small area, like this little red ectomycorrhizal fungi right in the middle? If it's physically connected to the Norway spruce on the right, and then physically connected to the European beech on the left, that essentially creates a bridge between the root systems of these two tree species. This is, in theory, a network of fungi that can colonize and connect two or more plants in a very localized area. Excuse me. Evidence has shown this could be from the same species of plant or different species of plant, just sort of depends. But most likely this is incredibly complex, like, you know, way more complex than very surface level, with, you know, these networks, these physical connections occurring between multiple fungal species, multiple trees, multiple plants, again, within a relatively local area. So why would these networks form? Like, why would evolution drive, you know, these networks to form? Like, what do you need potentially to allow that fungal threads to physically connect two trees? Well, one, you need the trees there, and we see this a lot in northeastern, excuse me, forests, but also out west. You need certain plants, you need trees to be there. You need resources in soils. I've done some work exploring mycorrhizal fungi and networks in urban soils, and more exurban, more rural soils. And the amount of resources in a soil matters. Similarly with low disturbance. Areas that have been disturbed by humans or other means generally have less mycorrhizal fungi, generally have less of these network potentials. So a healthy forest generally may have more of these networks. So what has the potential to transfer within these networks? Well, there's been some really good evidence that things like carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen can move within a fungal network. Those threads of fungi can move carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. They can move things like water. We've seen water, and I'll show a video here in just a sec. Things like not butter, but lipids, which are these very relatively complex carbon-based molecules that absolutely move. There's been a handful, and I'm going to put a big asterisk here, a handful, 2-3 studies that show stress hormones or hormones produced by plants, can move within these networks. And so I'm going to just, hopefully, again, these videos we're going to show, I'm going to show three quick videos, excuse me. Hopefully these are showing up on y'all screens. But what we can think about, and this is just a top-down view of the camera that was developed earlier this year that allows sort of viewpoint of to how these mycorrhizal fungi grow within soils. Incredibly complex organisms, but like when you plant a new tree, a new sapling in the backyard, or once an oak tree, the acorn cracks open and you've got root and shoot development. The fungi are going to grow through soils, find their way to the root system of whatever tree it is, and again, physically connect into all the trees, all the plants in that local area, potentially creating a large network. And so when we look at sort of, how do we know these things may move within these vast networks? This is an early view. It's a little blurry, so I apologize in advance, but what you're seeing is like these little threads here, these little lines. These are those fungal threads. And this is obviously a microscopic view here. And that bright green, whitish color, you can think of that as just like a nutrient. So I'm going to let this play. And so you can see just how much of this the potential nutrient, like a nitrogen or phosphorus, moves within these fungal networks. Just constant movement, with water, with those nutrients, or maybe even other chemicals like plant hormones, stress hormones, or allelopathic chemicals, maybe plant derived. Who I think we're just beginning to understand, how these fungi move them. What's going on the sort of the fungal level that may be really critical for these networks to form and function. So I'm just going to maybe go one with a little less blurry. But again, we've got a little thread here, and this is a really nice sort of viewpoint. But what you can see, hopefully, is a constant flow within these fungal networks, these threads of nutrients, of water. And again, sort of reminding that fungi and trees need this relationship to occur. The reason why fungi need this relationship is, again, they cannot obtain food, nutrition. They can't grow without the sugars from the plant. So this is just them moving it all around their forms, both directions, constant movement within these fungal threads. All right, one more video here. Gonna hit play. This is just released just a few weeks ago, an incredible paper that I'm just currently digesting, developed some really interesting technology. I think that's one of the hindrances of this work is, how do we understand the incredible complexity of this, an oak tree in Dutchess County may have 1,000 quote unquote species of fungi attached to its roots. That's millions, billions, trillions of quote unquote individuals of fungi attached to a mature red oak tree, let's say. How do we as researchers understand that incredible complexity? Well, maybe that's due to some really cool technology. Let's figure out how we can better understand that, and we can do that with real-time view, which is what this image is showing here. Real-time view movement. You can see it moving quickly in some areas. It's gonna speed up here in just a second. So this is sort of new for how this fungi may be moving resources between trees. Okay, just a few more slides, and then I'd love to take some questions here. So in theory, within these vast, incredibly complex networks, there is resource sharing. So nutrients phosphorus, nitrogen, water, are transferred within this incredible network, from trees to other trees, from trees to other plants. There's a really cool study from, I think, 2015 that showed that nutrients from a spring ephemeral moved from that spring ephemeral to a rhododendron. So, nutrients, things potentially are moving in these incredible dynamic ways that most likely is bidirectional. So there's a lot of things potentially moving in these networks. But one of the questions I think we as ecologists, as researchers, need to really focus on for the next 5 or 10 years is, it seems, just from current evidence, that the amount of nutrients and water that move are relatively low for like a mature redwood or a mature oak or maple, tulip. These are just relatively small amounts for what a mature tree would need. And this has also been shown in young saplings. Some of the work I did with red maples showed this as well in young, what was that, 1.5-year-old saplings, again, relatively small amounts. So are these ecologically relevant amounts? Like, does this matter? Well, it might matter if you're like a large tree sending resources, potentially, in theory, to a developing younger tree, right? It may matter in that case, but this is on scientists, on us to explore, to develop hypotheses for, and develop cool new experiments. So one of the things I get asked about a lot is, if these networks form, do they improve plant growth or tree growth? In theory, and this is the ecologist in me, maybe. In theory, if you were to plant 2 ectomycorrhizal fungi tree species, again, these are those species that only wrap themselves around the root cell, they can't penetrate in. If you were to plant, let's say, an oak next to a pine, in theory, they could grow better because they can share resources. That would be similar if you planted 2 arbuscular mycorrhizal tree species. Again, these are the species that penetrate into the cell wall, like a maple or a tulip. If you planted those next to each other, in theory, they would grow better. Sort of following this logic a little bit, if in theory you were to plant an oak next to a maple, there would be no benefit because they physically cannot form that network. They just can't physically do it. They don't associate with the same mycorrhizal fungi species, so they just can't form that network together. This general idea matches some data that I, from my PhD, where I found that red oak and red pines did grow better next to each other than red oak and red maples. That was on 2-year-old saplings over a period of 3 years. Other studies have shown this as well. So in theory, maybe, but again, this is where I'll hedge. We just need some more evidence to consistently show that pattern and then tie that back to this potential network. And so again, in a broad scale, we can think about how this may work in a large forest, and the term that researchers within this field use, and I'm going to just take a step back and just say the idea of mother trees, these large, very old species or individuals within a forest. This has been known by populations around the globe for millennia, for thousands of years. This idea of how important these individuals are. So we as scientists sort of have adapted this term, but just to highlight, communities, folks around the globe have known about this topic for a very long time. But in theory, these old species, these incredibly mature trees within northeastern forests, northwestern forests, wherever, in theory, if there is this giant network, these would be the species that are the most connected. Hundreds of trees in a local area, in theory, could be connected to this one species. And because it has so much, it's so big, it's got so much sugar, so much nutrients. In theory, if it's connected to this network, really nicely can nurture younger trees in an understory, helping the overall forest develop. Um, and just want to highlight just one more point before we end. I've seen I'm almost at my 7 o'clock deadline here. But why, when the world is fungi shuttling a resource between trees or plants, like what is the fungi doing? Why not just take any resource and grow? Like, why would you shuttle it? Well, maybe, and again, I'm just going to say we need a little bit more evidence here, but in theory, it seems that the fungi within soils, within a woodland, within a forest, might sort of favor anthropomorphized equal distribution of all of these resources. If this network, performs like we maybe think, fungi would want sort of resources to be equally distributed within this local area. Because if we think about it from a fungal perspective, they want to be connected physically to as many trees as they can. The more trees that they're connected to, in theory, the more sugars that they can obtain. So the fungi just want to be connected to as many plants, as many trees, get those sugars. From a tree perspective, they also want to be connected to as many fungi as possible. The more fungi they are connected to, in theory, the more nutrients they can obtain. So they're both, fungi and trees, want to be more connected as much as possible. So, then the question is, there's some interesting evidence that fungi may be making sort of quote unquote sophisticated decisions about where these nutrients are going. What role do fungi play potentially in shuttling or moving nutrients from one tree to the next? And just one more slide here. I mentioned plants and fungi have existed together for 450 million years. I mean, it is an incredibly important feature of the natural world today, just as it was millions of years ago. It has helped plants diversify, incredibly complex. I mean, if we look at redwoods out in California or baobabs in Madagascar, incredibly vast array of diversity of plant life helped by fungi. In my mind, that means that this relationship is stable and sort of an evolutionary sort of perspective. Millions of years, these two organisms have coexisted, physically bonded to each other for the sort of improvement of global function. This is a stable relationship. So if this network forms like the theory suggests, then both the plant, the fungi, would both benefit when there's vast trading going on, when there's nutrients moving within this biological marketplace. And then this is just my opinion. I'm going to just pause and just say this next point is just me, just a researcher within the field. Other researchers I know disagree with me, so just a grain of salt here with this next point is if these networks again act, and again, we're still learning so much, but if they are, as the theory suggests, moving things around underground in these vast networks, to me, it doesn't suggest that these are like, cooperation agreements between the fungi and the plant, but this really interesting marketplace, where everyone is out for themselves, and that's anthropomorphized like crazy, but the tree benefits, the plant benefits, the fungi benefits. So this is a relatively sort of tree-centric approach. But if that is the case, then it makes generally the woodland or the forest more healthy because there's more things moving around, more nutrients, etc. Okay. So again, one more quick thing. One of the things we don't fully understand is nutrients get moved. We've seen it under a microscope. We know fungi are moving resources. What happens to when, tree A gives it to tree B? What does tree B do with that nutrient, that resource? In my estimation, we're we still need a lot of data, a lot of good studies, both in the field, in the laboratory or a greenhouse. This is sort of the next stage of understanding is what does tree bee do with it? 1 minute past my deadline. I want to thank you all for letting me talk about fungi and trees and plants for the past 55 minutes. I could legitimately talk about this for hours and hours. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, please feel free to email me, kutoss@si.edu. If you want to take a picture of a tree, send it to me. Love that as well. So again, thank you all for listening, and any questions, please let me know. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you, Steve.
Was that a lot?
There's so much to think about. My head is still spinning a little bit, and I could have listened to it for many more hours. So don't even worry
Okay.
about the time.
Yeah, I could have had to keep going.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, we'll be sending a follow-up email that's got a list of resources and links to Steve's website and a list of publications and a link to the recording of this webinar as well. So please keep adding your questions into the Q&A. It looks like there are a lot in there already. So let's be diving into that. And just one thing before we start Q&A, I want to thank everybody for being part of this wonderful webinar series. Whether you've attended one or two or all 6 of them, we've learned a lot together, and we're so grateful to all of you for coming out to these webinars. We really appreciate you. All right, the very first question, this was bound to come up. Where is the largest mycelium layer in the US and in New York?
A great question. I think current estimates is the largest. It kind of depends on which researcher you ask. I think the estimate is is it in Colorado or Oregon? I'm sorry, my mind is blanking. There is estimation from a few research groups that there is this, what they call the largest organism on the planet, somewhere in, oh man, I'm sorry, I cannot quite remember. I think it's Colorado or Oregon. Sorry, I legitimately, this needs to be my homework, but there is some evidence that there's really old, really vast, massive, like we're talking acres and acres of one individual mycelium network, like individual, somewhere in Oregon or Colorado. I can't quite remember. It's not Utah, but anyway, it's somewhere in there. Northeast, I would probably say, what's the oldest growth here in the Northeast? Maybe up in like northern New York?
That's a really good question. The soils here are so disturbed by centuries of agriculture and logging and extractive industry. So I've never heard of any findings of anything large in the Northeast.
They do a ton of work at Harvard at their not national forest, at their forest. They have an area, but if I had to just guess, I don't know this. This is just pure guesswork. It's somewhere in northern New York, maybe Vermont. Maybe there's some of those areas that like lack disturbance in Vermont. Maybe somewhere. Maybe. Anyway, great question.
Thank you. I have heard Colorado is what I've heard.
Colorado? Okay, I couldn't remember which Western state it was.
Yeah, it's not definitive, but a lot of Oregon is dry, so I would imagine that potentially Colorado, given the precipitation on the kind of continental divide there.
Yeah, good, really nice point.
Yeah. So next one is kind of seems like a shout out, but I want to reframe it as a question, as if I could. So a guest is asking if you've heard of a specific company that's using mycelium to create packaging for shipping purposes, as well as vegan bacon made out of mycelium. I'm going to change that to the question of what are your thoughts about making packaging out of mycelium and foods?
Love it. Absolutely love it. There's a group, organization that has essentially tracked every fungal or mycelium-based organization from the research side to the production side. I follow anything that sort of wraps itself around using these incredible organisms for anything from food. I have tried some mycelium-based foods. They're delicious. At packaging, it's all great. Any use, there's some, I think, some really interesting work using them as also um, like specifically to create clothing. Is another, like, I mean, anything that uses like a natural resource that, fungi, you just give them a little bit of nutrition and sugar and they grow so quickly. I mean, it's really rapid growth. So yeah, it's fantastic.
So many possibilities in the fungal
I know,
kingdom.
it's like whatever we can think of, like, it's great.
And now getting back to the mycorrhiza. So this question is asking, if the soil containing the mycorrhiza fungi is disturbed, for example, through digging, will the fungi regrow from the roots, or will they need to regenerate from the original source?
That is a superb question. Really, really nice question. I would say one, depends on the type of disturbance. There's a lot of evidence in the Midwest, particularly with tillage or long-term tillage operations, obviously are soil disturbing. Those struggle to come back. Generally, they would have to redisperse into that disturbed area through spore dispersal, and then grow from that spore. That seems to be the source of growth after a disturbance, relative to like the species that can survive that disturbance on the plant root itself. They're there. I mean, there's some great work in Southern California in heavily damaged fire areas that fungi can survive even intense fires. So if they survive, then the theory would suggest that they just grow from that. It's a superb question. I would like to see a little bit more evidence from different types of disturbances. There was a ton of work in like nitrogen deposition, obviously, as y'all know. But I'd like to see some more in different areas. But yeah, generally it'd have to get dispersed back into that area.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that one of the best places to hunt for morel mushrooms out west is where there's been a disturbance, particularly fire disturbance.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, next question, kind of along the same lines. Are earthworms beneficial to mitochondria development?
No question. Absolutely. Obviously, they hold incredible importance for soil health. It's funny. I'm just starting, as of 2026, starting a project exploring almost that exact question in areas around Maryland. It's funny you asked that. So far, it seems that yes, earthworms and fungi interact. Maybe there's some feeding going on by the earthworm, but um, in general, the earthworm helps the structure of the soil, which in turn helps the fungi grow and weave themselves through. So they sort of help each other in a way, overall improving soil health. So maybe a few more questions to answer, which is why I'd like to explore that. But yeah, earthworms, nematodes, soil inverts, they all sort of interact with fungi. There's still some questions as to sort of, is it indirect interactions? Is it indirect? So some cool explorations in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that world down below our feet.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Now, the next question, I love this. How are invasive plant species, which are changing the ecology of forests, affecting fungi? And can fungi be used to combat invasive species like bittersweet or multiflora rose?
Gosh, again, superb question. I mean, that is such a really nice question. There is, I want to be careful here. There's some evidence, some good evidence that invasives non-natives introduced into a particular area do impact the mycorrhizal fungi community, no doubt, through all sorts of changing both the composition of a woodland or a forest or whatever it is, grassland, but also just changing the dynamics about what's happening below ground. I think there's some wonderful experiments, particularly in Europe, that have shown this. So yes, invasive can change mycorrhizal fungi communities. They change the entire soil ecosystem. I explored somewhat of a similar question in New Mexico a few years ago, looking at some invasives versus natives out there. So yes, answer is yes. You notice that I cannot answer a simple question. So yes. The second part of that original question, there's a debate about using mycorrhizal fungi as an addition to soils. I would say that we just don't know enough, in my opinion, just mine. Adding mycorrhizal fungi to soils in theory is a good thing, but in practice, I think there was a study that was published late last year. Something like 90% of commercial mycorrhizal fungi additions don't perform the function as intended. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, still a lot of understanding about this dynamic, incredibly important group of organisms. But in theory, it works. Like if we look at it from a human perspective, adding in like fecal microbiome transplants for humans works, particularly for folks that have certain conditions. So we know that helps. It's funny, we're actually trying it at the National Zoo. We're trying fecal transplants for animals, and our early work is showing it does help as well. In soils, it's an incredibly dynamic, incredibly complex. So I think there's still some work to be done trying to figure it out, but hopefully we'll get there in 10 years. So I don't know if I can answer that second part, but yes to the first part.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's never with you scientists, there's always a complicated answer, right?
Yeah, it's like I'm realizing as I'm talking, I'm like, just answer the question. Stop talking.
No, but that's the fun part about science is when
Yeah.
there's a defined yes or no, then it's not that exciting. You're standing on the
Exactly.
shoulders of giants and filling in these gaps that expose more gaps.
Absolutely.
That's the fun of it. And speaking of science, we got a question coming up. So in your video of substances flowing through fungal threads,
Yep.
what was the substance that was actually labeled with a fluorescent dye you were tracking? And yes, the person is a scientist.
Oh no. It's got to be nitrogen, or no, it's probably C14. Oh no. That's my homework. I need to triple check. I'm almost positive it's carbon. It's an isotope of carbon. Let me just or C12. Let me just double check.
Okay.
Maybe that's my quick homework. I'm almost positive it's carbon in that early video with the green thing moving. I'm almost positive that was carbon. The others were just like viewpoints down. But the one that were fluorescently tagged, almost positive it's carbon, but let me triple check that.
Always worth a triple check.
Yeah, nothing wrong with a little triple check.
And on a related note, also about the videos, observing that there's two-way traffic in those videos of fungal transport. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's somewhat of a new-ish discovery. Like the thought was always that they do, and the early videos showed, somewhat. But I think this new technology that goes way beyond my head, with cameras and specific equipment that computational equipment that literally allows a real-time view into the physical movement. I think as we've gotten these videos from these wonderful scientists across the globe, we're like, oh, this is, constant bi-directional movement. Because like the threads are maybe not a perfect circle, but they have a roundish appearance. So there is space for bi-directional movement within these threads. the paper that just came out just a few weeks ago was showing that there's potentially like a fungal control for how the movement happens. Like there's like this push and pull that occurs. It's fascinating from a fungal perspective. But yes, in short, it seems that there's bidirectional movement in all throughout this entire network, which if those networks, the theory of those networks form, then that holds really key estimations for how nutrients move within these vast networks underground.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And I just have to say the whole presentation was fantastic. And I took some time to look up that largest mycelium, and it is in Oregon. So you were correct.
Okay.
Our next question, in your example of a spring ephemeral sharing resources with a tree, how close would they have to be? Is there a distance limit?
Again, superb question. So a lot of the evidence we have for resource transfer in different types of plants and trees are relatively small areas, meters. Particularly if we're doing it in the laboratory like I was, or in a growth chamber, or in a greenhouse. A lot of that work that I did, I mean, that's like they're right next to each other. Some of the work at Dr. Samard and others at the Pacific Northwest, they would plant like a young tree right next to a mature, and then use that. Of course, you're talking about meters there. However, I think in theory, like, again, I would argue that we as scientists, we as researchers have only just touched on the complexity here. Oh, sorry. In theory, it could go much further than that, like 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 meters. However long or large that mycelium network could grow, however large the woodland or forest is, maybe not miles or kilometers, but I would argue there's a potential for much larger formations. There was some great work that showed like even if like on the edge of a forest, those mycorrhizal fungi still sort of extend like 20, 30 meters out from the edge of the forest. So I would argue that experimentation wise, we keep it short, but in theory, they could be much more broader, longer networks.
And I think the next question is kind of a follow-up on that, asking what is it that traditional foresters know about mother trees? And I think they're referring to the millennia of experience of indigenous peoples that you alluded to in your talk.
Yeah, that's sort of like a pet peeve. I apologize for that one. I just the idea of using that term always sort of like not bothers me, just is like a pet peeve thing. It just like I've talked to communities from the Pacific Northwest to the work down in New Mexico, some folks in Europe. Again, the idea of the understanding of these incredibly old, incredibly important, massive trees, particularly out west, just how critical they play, the roles they play in ecosystems. Don't cut them down, obviously. And while I can't speak directly to like forester applications, I have had some really great discussions with forestry companies, I guess is the proper term there. Just sort of curious their perspectives and sort of how they view things. So anyway, that's almost like a weird pet peeve of mine.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Our next question is about plant communities such as oak and hickory, blueberries and huckleberries, and are they supported by shared ectomycorrhizal fungi?
Is huckleberry? Ooh, I'm gonna have to check that one. I think so. If y'all want, I have a list that somebody created like half decade ago of every single plant family, including all tree families, and their mycorrhizal partners, so you can show who associates with whom. I can share that with y'all to share with the other folks as well. I think so. I think they can form the same fungal networks. I need to double check about huckleberry though.
Okay, and I think that comes close to answering the next question, is where can we find a list of ectomycorrhizal and arbuscular mycorrhizal trees?
I will absolutely. It's I don't know who created it. It was passed to me by another researcher, and I use it all the time. I will absolutely send that as well as the slides if y'all want those.
Yeah, that would be great. If you send those to me, I can include them in the follow-up email.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And our next question is, what other tree species pairs are good with each other in theory?
I love the addition of in theory at the end. In theory, I mean, relative to the last question, any ectomycorrhizal tree or tree that associates only with ectomycorrhizal, any of those pairings, in theory, would grow next to each other better. Just in theory, any pine, any birch, any beech, I can't even think now. And then on the opposite, any arbuscular, maples are the one I choose a lot, tulips. Anyway, so in theory, any of those, if they associate with the same fungal species, then in theory, they would grow better next to each other. As far as I'm aware, there's only two tree species on the planet, I think, that associate with both types, arbuscular and ecto. It's very rare in the tree world. Rainbow eucalyptus, I think, is one, and I think aspen is the other. I think there's a lot of researchers that are exploring those two tree species to figure out like why would they both associate, and then how does that dynamic work? So a lot of really cool applications if plants grow next to each other. We'll be using those tree species because they can sort of be bridges to like a community in a forest, that sort of thing.
Wow.
I know.
So much interesting research. And the next question is kind of taking it to the other end of the spectrum. What happens to the network when a tree dies?
Ooh, superb question. Again, I'm gonna like try to hedge again here. In theory, if the tree dies, meaning it is no longer photosynthesizing, so it has no vegetation, no active cell metabolism, it is, for lack of a better term, completely dead. In theory, over time, the mycorrhizal fungi are going to, this is anthropomorphized, but leave that rooting system because they're not obtaining anything from the tree. But that probably, I don't know if that question's been answered, like after tree death, how long does the mycorrhizal fungi stay there? Because there's still, even after what we would consider like tree death, there's still some activity within the rooting system as stuff's being moved around and cells start to recycle and develop. So in short, I don't know if that question's been fully answered yet, but in theory, depends on timescale maybe. I'd love to explore that. Maybe
It must be sort of a transition from mycorrhizal fungi to the decomposers.
Exactly.
A community shift.
I was just thinking, like, how cool would it be not to kill a tree? We shouldn't be killing trees for science, but if we did, like, how cool to map that, like, maybe every month or something? Like, how cool would that be? Maybe I should do that. I might, whoever that was, I'm going to cite you as my experimental thought there, because it's a really good idea. Anyway.
Okay, our next question has to do with farming and mycorrhizae. So does the practice of no-till better benefit soil mycorrhizae than tilling?
100%. No question. I think there's some really good evidence to show that in a variety of different farming landscapes from Southeast United States, Midwest, California, New Mexico, long-term tillage practices. I mean, I don't need to tell this audience. is connected to poor soil health. Mycorrhizal fungi, high diversity of those organisms are a good sign of soil health. So yes, no-till is generally considered to be good for both the abundance and diversity of mycorrhizal fungi. So yes, in short, yes.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next question about invasive jumping worms, assuming that since they are so destructive to soils, they would also affect negatively the health of the soil fungi. They're really doing that kind of soil disturbance that tilling would do in a way.
100%, absolutely.
And do you know any research on those jumping worms? We've been getting them pretty severely in our area, and we usually get a lot of questions about the long-term impacts of them.
If you don't mind, I keep saying that's my homework. I'm gonna just check that because I'm not coming anything to my mind as I write and try to talk at the same time, which is impossible for me. I'm going to check if anybody's explored that. I'm not aware. Nothing's coming to mind, but I'd like to double check because I would assume that somebody must be, because that's such a really important, obviously, feature. Maybe SUNY. There's somebody at SUNY is. I need to just like, the Rolodex in my mind is struggling right now. But I think maybe, but let me double check. If so, I'll find maybe some of the research, and maybe I'll send that with the slides as well, if that's.
That would be great. Yeah, every time a new invasive rolls into the area, there's a scramble. Who's doing work on this? Where has it been before? Who knows about this? What can we do? What are the impacts going to be? We've heard this story before.
Yeah, a few
Read
times.
this book before. Well, I think we've run through all of our questions. Thank you so much, Steve. We have all learned a lot, and I feel like we might have given your lab a list of questions to explore for future grad students and post.
I was about to say, now I have like countless studies to do, so I thank you all very much.
You're very welcome. We're glad we could help out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for coming tonight. We are going to wrap up this very last webinar in our series. So everyone stay tuned. We'll be kicking off the next season of Earth Matters in November. So stay tuned for that, and you'll be hearing from us when that opens up for registration. And in the meantime, everyone enjoy your year. Thank you so much again, Steve, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you.